name's Jeff Robinson, and I am doing a series of videos critiquing Calvinism. And these videos are based on my book, Saved by Grace Through Faith, or Saved by Decree, which is a biblical and theological critique of Calvinism. In the previous video, we're looking at limited atonement, L in tulip, limited atonement. And in the previous video, we looked at some biblical texts that refute some texts that are appealed to by Calvinists to justify the idea of a limited atonement on the one hand, and we also looked at some texts that support the notion of a general atonement, specifically texts that relate Christ's coming to die or to save sinners. And since everybody is a sinner, then Christ died for everybody. The previous video, if you're interested to look at this equivalent topic, namely biblical considerations associated with limited atonement, is the video number 13 in the first series. And in that video, I rejected the idea that Christ died for only a few and argued for a general atonement. But a general atonement, Christ dying for everybody, does not lead to the idea of a universal salvation, which is a common criticism of Calvinism. I'll come back to that in a moment. Calvinists link Christ's death and personal salvation tightly together. They're a unit. If Christ died for everybody, then obviously everybody must be saved in their mind. But this is actually a mistaken way of viewing the atonement and the work of the cross. Christ's death was directed primarily to the Father, and he paid the penalty for sin that a holy God demands. Christ's death fully satisfied that demand. This is a transaction between Christ on the cross and the Father. Any individuals are not in mind in that transaction, that satisfaction of God's holy wrath against sin. But whether any individual personally benefits from the fruit of that cross, in terms of their own salvation, depends on appropriating the work of the cross by faith. So we see that Christ's death makes salvation possible for anybody who appropriates the work of that cross by faith. This sketch that I've generated here shows the basic difference that I'm trying to bring out here. Calvinism views the atonement and salvation of any individual as a unit together. Non-Calvinists, on the other hand, separate the two. The atonement is one thing directed towards the Father, and salvation of any individual, which is, of course, requires the cross work, it's not apart from the cross work, but still depends on appropriating the cross work by faith. I want to discuss now, looking at a theological issue related to this question of limited atonement, this question: does the cross actually save or just make salvation possible? This is a common criticism raised by Calvinists. R.C. Sproul, for example, poses the question this way: is Christ a real saviour or merely a potential saviour? Was God's divine plan to make redemption possible or to make it certain? Calvinism's answer to this question is seen, for example, in John Murray's book, Redemption Accomplished and Applied. There's the unit, accomplished and applied, to go together. Calvinists see two problems if the work of the cross is separated from the actual salvation of any individual. The first is, as I discussed previously, the question of universalism, everybody being saved. But as I mentioned earlier, this is due to a failure to distinguish between the atonement as an objective aspect of salvation and the subjective appropriation of the cross work as a personally saving experience by faith. Note, I prefer the word appropriate the work of the cross, whereas Calvinists tend to shy away from that work, but rather prefer the work of application, what God does to the individual. he applies the work of the cross to the individual. Many scriptures speak of the need to appropriate the salvation that Christ's death makes possible. For example, John 1:11 and 12. He came to his own, and those who were his own did not receive him. But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become the children of God, even to those who believe in his name. Note the language of appropriation here. As many as received him, that's appropriated him, he gave the right to become children of God. Some do not receive Christ, they reject Christ, they do not appropriate the work of the cross and apply it to their own lives. Others appropriate the work of the cross and receive Christ, and they do so by believing in his name. In other words, by faith. The second criticism, or the second problem that Calvinists see if the work of the cross is separated from the salvation of any particular individual, is that if faith is a condition for receiving the benefits of the atonement, then faith itself is in some sense a work or a basis of salvation. Faith itself is seen as a meritorious work contributing to one's own salvation. Michael Horton, for example, says this: in this view, faith not only receives this reconciliation that the cross makes possible, but accomplishes it, and faith becomes a saving work. But the Bible always views salvation as a grace gift, not something in any way earned or merited. Paul's well-known passage in Ephesians chapter 2 verse 8, for by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God. While the Bible insists consistently that salvation is by grace, it equally is insistent that it is appropriated by faith. No faith means that the gift of salvation made possible through the death of Christ finds no realization in the individual. The root problem again is the Calvinist refusal to separate the work of the cross as an atonement that objectively satisfies the need that sin be punished by a death, and the appropriation of that saving work by faith on the part of any individual. This is how I express it in a paragraph in my book. Only the failure to distinguish between the objective and subjective aspects of the atonement raises this spectre of universal salvation, with faith viewed as a contributing factor. Objectively, the atonement is universally efficacious in satisfying the righteous demands of a holy God that sin be punished. Subjectively, however, the atonement is not efficacious in the life of any individual apart from the condition of faith being met. This condition is a divinely required condition, as many scriptures testify. In short, the atoning sacrifice that the cross represents is never automatically applied to anyone, as Calvinists suppose. Rather, it makes salvation possible only for those who meet the God-required condition of faith. In my book, I discuss actually 8 theological issues associated with the idea of a limited atonement. We discussed 2 in the previous video, number 13, and another one here. The one here being, of course, does the cross actually save or just make salvation possible? Additional topics you may be interested to know that I have in my book are the question of double payment for sin. If the atonement is a general atonement, then there's a sense in which Christ paid for the sins of an individual, but any individual who rejects the work of the cross has to pay for his own sins as well. So this raises the spectre of a double atonement for sin, or double payment for sin. I also discuss 4-point Calvinism. Many Calvinists agree that the biblical evidence for a general atonement is quite strong and agree with it, and so drop the L in tulip and become 4-point Calvinists. I discuss the consistency of such a position. Another topic I discuss is Amyraldianism. Amyraldianism was a compromise theory of the atonement developed in the 17th century, designed to provide a mediating position between the harsh particularity and individualism of Calvinism with a more general approach of Arminianism to the question of salvation. I discuss ammiraldianism. And then I also discuss the problem of a justification for evangelism if limited atonement is true, and if God has an elect for whom Christ died, and only for them, then what sense does it make to evangelize? In the introduction to the video below, I provide a link to my book in Amazon. I provide a link to an interview that I did with Leighton Flowers on Soteriology 101, and a link to a review of my book by Pastor Sean Wilson, a fair review. If you'd like to look at those resources, please feel free to do so. And incidentally, if you want a complete list of my videos to date, I have my playlist, which it can be found by typing in GDR Theology in the heading, the search heading in YouTube. In the next video, we'll discuss biblical considerations associated with the idea of perseverance of the saints. No, irresistible grace, biblical considerations, and then after that, theological considerations, following the same format I follow in my book. So until then, bye for now.